I told myself it was just another interview, the kind you rehearse for and forget once it's over. Still, my hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the elevator doors. My name is Ethan Parker, and on paper my life looked stable: steady relationship, modest apartment, predictable routines. Stability, I'd learned, could also feel like standing still. That morning, Daniel barely looked up from his phone when I told him where I was going. He wished me luck in the same tone he used to comment on the weather. I didn't blame him. We had been together long enough that encouragement had become a habit instead of a feeling. I left our apartment quietly, wondering when silence had replaced curiosity between us. The office building rose clean and glassy against the sky, all sharp lines and confidence. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. I checked in, took a seat, and practiced answers I'd memorized weeks ago. What I couldn't prepare for was the unexpected way my chest tightened when my name was called. Ethan Parker. The voice was calm, steady. I looked up and saw Lucas Reed standing there, tablet in hand, expression open but measured. He was dressed simply, nothing flashy, yet there was an ease in the way he carried himself that immediately unsettled me. He shook my hand, firm but brief, and smiled as if he already knew something about me. The interview room was small, intimate in a way that made it impossible to hide behind rehearsed confidence. Lucas asked thoughtful questions, not just about my experience but about how I handled uncertainty, how I learned from failure. When I spoke, he listened, not the polite nodding I was used to, but real attention. It felt like being seen through clear glass. At one point, I lost my train of thought. Instead of rushing me, Lucas waited. The pause wasn't awkward, it was generous. I found myself answering more honestly than planned, admitting doubts, ambitions I rarely spoke aloud. He didn't judge or interrupt. He simply nodded, as if honesty were the most reasonable thing in the world. As the conversation unfolded, I forgot to perform. I forgot to impress. I just talked, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, I felt awake. When the interview ended, Lucas stood and thanked me for my time. His smile lingered a second longer than necessary. "No matter what happens," he said, "it was good meeting you." Those words followed me out of the building, down the street, into the noise of the city. I replayed the interview in my mind, telling myself the unease I felt was just adrenaline. Interviews could do that. New possibilities always stirred restlessness. That evening, Daniel asked how it went. I told him it was fine. I didn't mention Lucas's name, or the way the room had felt warmer than it should have. Daniel nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the television. I sat beside him, aware of the space between us, aware that my thoughts were already somewhere else. Lying in bed later, sleep refused to come. I kept thinking about the pause Lucas had given me, about how easily words had surfaced in his presence. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't looking for anything. I already had a life, a partner, a plan. Yet as I stared at the ceiling, one unsettling truth settled in: the interview hadn't just tested my qualifications. It had exposed a quiet hunger I'd been pretending didn't exist. And whether I liked it or not, something had already begun, something I couldn't unfeel, and wasn't sure I wanted to stop. The offer arrived 2 days later, concise and professional, yet it sent a sharp thrill through me. I read the email twice before forwarding it to Daniel with a brief message: "I got it." He replied with a thumbs up emoji and a reminder to pick up groceries on my way home. The contrast felt louder than it should have. My first week at the office passed in a blur of introductions and orientation sessions, but everything seemed to orbit around Lucas Reed. As my manager, he kept our interactions efficient, almost formal, as if the ease from the interview had been carefully folded away. Still, there were moments, small, nearly invisible, that hinted at something unspoken. A shared glance during meetings. A quiet joke exchanged while the others packed up. Nothing that crossed a line, yet nothing that felt empty. We worked late one evening to finalize a report. The office had thinned out, leaving behind the low hum of air conditioning and the city lights blinking beyond the windows. Lucas handed me a mug of coffee without asking how I took it. "I noticed. I always noticed. You're settling in well," he said, scanning the screen over my shoulder. His voice was calm, but there was warmth beneath it. "Not everyone adapts this quickly." "I had a good teacher," I replied, then wondered why my heart beat faster at my own words. We talked more as the days went on. Not about personal details at first, just observations, work frustrations, ambitions, the strange comfort of routines. Lucas listened the same way he had during the interview, with patience and intent. I found myself choosing words carefully, wanting to be understood, wanting to matter in the space between his sentences. At home, the difference was impossible to ignore. Daniel and I moved around each other politely, like roommates careful not to collide. Our conversations revolved around schedules and errands. I stopped bringing work stories home, not because Daniel discouraged me, but because he didn't ask. One afternoon, Lucas and I took our coffee break outside, standing near the edge of the building where the noise softened. He spoke about a past relationship, briefly, without details, only that it had ended because they wanted different futures. There was no bitterness in his tone, just acceptance. Some things end quietly, he said. That doesn't mean they didn't matter. The words lodged themselves somewhere deep. I nodded, unable to offer anything meaningful in return. What could I say, when I was still pretending not to notice the quiet ending unfolding in my own life? I began to anticipate moments with Lucas, measuring my days by brief exchanges and shared tasks. It scared me how natural it felt. I told myself it was admiration, professional respect, the excitement of a new job. Labels were comforting that way. They made things manageable. But one evening, as I sat beside Daniel on the couch, my phone lit up with a message from Lucas, a simple question about a file. I answered immediately, without thinking. Daniel noticed, his gaze lingering on me a second too long. Work? He asked. Yeah, I said, and realized it was true in more ways than one. That night, guilt pressed against my chest. Nothing had happened. There was nothing to confess. And yet, I felt as if I were already keeping a secret, not of actions, but of attention, of where my thoughts drifted when I was supposed to be present. The next day, Lucas seemed distant, focused, as though he had sensed the shift and chosen caution.
The space unsettled me more than closeness would have. I understood then that something fragile had formed, something that could be damaged simply by acknowledging it. As I left the office that evening, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. I looked the same as always, but I felt bolted, pulled between who I was and who I was becoming. The realization followed me into the night. I wasn't standing at the edge of temptation anymore. I was already stepping into it, one quiet moment at a time.
Guilt arrived quietly, not as panic but as a steady pressure I carried with me. It surfaced in the mornings when Daniel brushed past me without really seeing me, and at night when I lay awake replaying conversations I pretended didn't matter. I hadn't touched anyone. I hadn't broken any promises aloud. Still, something essential had shifted, and I could feel it every time I said Lucas's name in my head. At work, Lucas Reed changed. He became more formal, more careful, as if he were placing deliberate distance between us. Meetings stayed strictly professional. Coffee breaks were suddenly solo affairs. I told myself it was for the best, yet the absence felt sharper than presence ever had. I understood then how attachment reveals itself most clearly when it's threatened. I caught him watching me once, just for a second, before looking away. The restraint in that gesture unsettled me more than any bold move could have. It meant he felt it too, whatever it was, and had chosen discipline over impulse. That knowledge made my chest ache. At home, Daniel finally noticed my distraction. He asked if something was wrong, his voice cautious, almost afraid of the answer. I told him work was stressful. He nodded, accepting the explanation with relief. The ease with which the lie settled between us frightened me. I wondered how long we had been surviving on convenient truths. The turning point came late one evening when Lucas asked if I could stay behind to help finish a presentation. The office emptied around us, leaving a silence that felt heavier than usual. We worked side by side, focused, efficient, avoiding anything personal. The tension hummed beneath every movement. When we finished, Lucas didn't immediately stand. He closed his laptop and exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself. "Ethan," he said, my name sounding different in his voice now, waited. "I need to be clear about something." I looked at him, already knowing this moment had been building for weeks. This can't continue, he said, not unkindly. The closeness. I don't cross lines. Not at work. Not with someone who belongs to someone else. The words landed softly but left no room for denial. I felt exposed, as if he had named something I'd been desperately trying not to see. I never meant for it to happen, I said. It was the truth, and also not enough. I know, Lucas replied. That's what makes it dangerous. Silence settled between us, honest and unforgiving. In it, I realized how much I had been leaning on him, not for romance, but for recognition, for a version of myself that felt alive again. Wanting him wasn't the real betrayal. Needing him was. I'm with someone, I said finally, the words tasting heavier than they ever had before. But I don't think I've been fully there for a long time. Lucas met my gaze, his expression steady but guarded. Then that's what you need to face, he said. Not me. I left the office shaken, grateful and devastated all at once. On the walk home, the city lights blurred, and for the first time I allowed myself to admit what I had been avoiding. My relationship with Daniel had ended emotionally long before Lucas entered my life. Lucas hadn't caused the fracture. He had revealed it. That night, lying beside Daniel, I felt the weight of choice pressing down on me. Staying meant continuing a quiet dishonesty that would only deepen. Leaving meant hurting someone who had trusted me, even if love had thinned between us.
As Daniel slept, I stared into the dark, knowing the comfort of indecision was slipping away. Whatever came next would demand courage I wasn't sure I had yet. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep standing in the space between truth and safety. Something had to give, and soon.
I didn't plan the conversation with Daniel. There was no script that could soften it, no perfect timing that would make the truth easier to hear. It happened on an ordinary evening, which somehow felt appropriate. Real endings, I'd learned, rarely announce themselves. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the same place where we had shared meals and routines for years. Daniel noticed my restlessness before I spoke. He always did, even when we pretended otherwise. There's something I need to say, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't interrupt. He waited, and that patience made the words harder, not easier. I told him the truth, not about Lucas in detail, but about the distance, the silence, the way I had drifted while still standing beside him. I admitted that I hadn't been fully present, that my heart had slowly slipped away before I had the courage to acknowledge it. Daniel listened without anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I felt it, he said. I just hoped it would pass. That honesty broke something open between us. We talked longer than we had in months, not to fix what was broken, but to understand how it had happened. There were no accusations, only shared responsibility and the grief of recognizing that love, once essential, had become insufficient. When it ended gently. Painfully, but gently. We agreed that holding on out of habit would only turn kindness into resentment. As I packed a small bag and stepped out into the night, I felt hollow, and strangely lighter. Truth, even when it hurts, has a way of clearing space. The days that followed were quiet. I moved through them deliberately, resisting the urge to reach for distraction. Lucas Reed stayed at a respectful distance, honoring the boundary he had drawn before I ever asked. That restraint mattered to me now more than ever. It told me this wasn't about escape or impulse. It was about choice. When we finally spoke again, it was outside the office, in neutral territory. Lucas didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He didn't rush me toward anything that resembled certainty. You did the hard part, he said simply. That counts. I realized then that what I felt for him had changed. It was quieter, less urgent, but more grounded. Desire had been replaced by possibility, and possibility felt far more fragile. I wasn't sure where it would lead, and for the first time, I didn't need to know. Weeks passed. Life settled into a new rhythm, lonelier, yes, but also honest. I learned to sit with myself again, to understand what I wanted beyond comfort and familiarity. Lucas and I shared time carefully, building something without secrecy or borrowed trust. Every step felt intentional. One evening, as we walked through the city, Lucas asked me if I was afraid. I considered the question seriously before answering. Yes, I said, but not of this. He smiled, not triumphant, not relieved, just present. And in that moment, I understood that love doesn't always arrive cleanly or at the right time. Sometimes it shows up to teach you what you've been avoiding, and sometimes it waits until you're ready to meet it without hiding. As I looked ahead, I didn't see a perfect future. I saw uncertainty, growth, and the quiet promise of something earned rather than stumbled into. And that, I realized, was more than enough to begin again.